Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Just welcome to the Roundtable on the media and genocide. Talking critically, about the current state of media, especially, of course, in relation to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, is crucially important for the work of this tribunal. We've got this amazing, this bunch of, just journalists and academics, today, and I'm perhaps the only person in this roundtable who has no connection to media or to journalism. First and foremost, a litigator. I litigate cases before courts and tribunals. And as all litigators would tell you, all cases succeed on the facts. You win or lose cases on the facts. And when it comes to international cases about mass atrocities, such facts are provided to us mostly by journalists, by brave journalists. Similarly, the media is crucial to win or lose the court of the public opinion. Any mass atrocity needs to create consent for its perpetration. The genocidaires need Haspara media to dehumanize the natives, to dehumanize Palestinians in this particular case, to render the victims of the genocide invisible, to create a false narrative of two-sidism. This is what we will discuss today with an amazing panel. Before I give them the word, I have to underline that we dedicate this roundtable, this discussion, first and foremost, to all those brave Palestinian journalists who lost their lives while fighting to give us the truth. You can see on the screen that we prepared a collage to commemorate them. As of yesterday, when our colleagues finished preparing this, there were 222 journalists who were targeted by the genocidaire forces. However, this morning we woke up to the sad news that yet another journalist, this time an Osama al-Ardit of North Gaza, was killed by Israeli forces along with 7 others at his home. That is, this number goes up day by day, unfortunately. In the words of the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, every time a journalist is killed, injured, arrested, or forced to go to exile, we lose fragments of the truth. Without further ado, let's now turn to our panel. We will start with Lubna Masarwa. Lubna is a journalist. This room, of course, you know her very well. She's the Palestine and Israel Bureau Chief of the Middle East Eye. Lubna, could you please tell us about the difficulties of reporting about this ongoing genocide from the very front, from the very field? We see in your example that being on the ground does not necessitate being an embedded journalist, but I'm quite sure this comes at a price.
To be honest, this is the first time I attend an event in the past 2 years, especially in this past 18 months. I think I feel speechless. This is the most documented genocide in the modern history, and the worst media Western coverage as well in modern history. So I just feel like there's not much I can add, and I even feel shy as a Palestinian who live in Jerusalem to speak about my own difficulties, because the true heroes are the Palestinian journalists in Gaza who are paying their life as a price to bring the truth to you outside. This is alongside of the silence of the mainstream media, the political elites in Europe, the US, and the Western governments, which put a lot of responsibility on us as Palestinian journalists, as alternative platforms as well of news, such as Middle East Eye, 972, Al Jazeera, and most of all, the citizen journalism, which is in the shoulders of many young journalists in Gaza, like Brittain, like Hind al-Khudari, like many others who are risking their life every day to bring the truth for us, and being an alternative for, I don't know even how to call the role the Western media played in this period, very shameful. We are shocked of the scale of the crimes, genocide, killing, destruction, but also we are shocked of the role of the Western media in this genocide. It had been shocking for all of us as Palestinians, how they can watch our life being eliminated, starvation, bodies, remains of bodies, babies being burned, and still being somehow silent about what's going on, and taking part in dehumanization of Palestinians. We could see that also in the way of coverage when Western media cover Israeli victims. They always have history. They always have life story, love story. They have names. They have everything, even the light in their faces. I remember the Times put the face of one of the mothers of the hostages. The light, the color, everything look different. While when it's coming to Palestinian victims, it's always mass. If in a good case, it's numbers. Even many massacres are not being covered in the media. Or, for example, when there was the deal of releasing hostages/prisoners, the media will not even write children. They will write minors or teenagers or any way to dismiss our human life. So I do think, for me, this 18 months had been very massive. I wake up every morning, I watch hundreds of movies, of short movies from, not movies, but material that I receive from my journalists in Khan Yunis, in Rafah, in North Gaza. I see a lot of bodies, a lot of hands, a lot of heads, a lot of grief, cry, mothers trying to identify the bodies of their children in mass graves. And it's shocking for me every day, the gap of what I witness, what I see, and the way it's covered is shocking for me. And I'm just speaking randomly. I didn't prepare. I wrote here a few notes, but it doesn't matter. I think it's mostly exposed for us something deeper, because we could argue in the past about they don't know. So all the young Palestinians will be that fixers running with that white journalist in Palestine and to teach them and educate them about what's going on. But now they know we can't say they are ignorant, right? We all, with WhatsApp, with Instagram, passing more and more footage of beheaded babies, burned children, bodies mixed with the flour of people who went to get food and to get flour and being murdered. And still, it's not changing. And I think it's putting us in a new fact of, like, who are the victims? Who's dying? What is skin color? What is where he's coming from? Is he Ukrainian or is he Palestinian? And this is where we have, as a Palestinians, we had a gathering a month ago in Nazareth, in 48 Palestine, to start thinking together, how to find the new platforms, how to tell our stories, because we can't rely anymore in Western media. And I want also to mention here something of mainstream media that entered Gaza in the Israeli tanks this 2 years. This is very massive, and writing for Le Monde, for BBC, Haaretz, of course. Will not happen in Ukraine. They will not join a Russian tank and entering Ukraine. So there's something here like media or Western media or mainstream Western media, let's say, let's be more correct in that, failed in covering and standing with the Palestinian people completely. And this should be discussed, should be worked out. And I do think people in the ground, in the world, which I think give us also hope. We see the turning point in the streets. We see more people angry, more people active, and we providing more of our work for them. I cover Palestine as long I wake up and my colleagues in the ground in Gaza and the West Bank wake up and still going and covering every morning for 600 days. They're still writing, they're insisting, and I think we should keep our work in all means. It's hard sometimes to feel like what difference we are doing, but we do. We are documenting. We have to push the wheel, and I'm sure the others may join one day. So thank you. Thank you for the hospitality. Thank you for the Bosnian sisters and friends for hosting us here as Palestinians. I just read today about a journalist who was killed 30 years ago for not leaving, refusing to leave. He was murdered. And all of my colleagues who I tried to convince some of them to leave Gaza, and they had the option, they refused to leave, and they still work. So they are the true heroes. Thank you.
Lubna, thank you very much, for these words, and in your person, we are really very grateful to all those Palestinian journalists, really. I mean, you're doing an amazing job. I will continue with Victoria Brittain. Again, many of you know her very well. Victoria has been reporting from Africa, the Middle East, once from Vietnam for many years, decades. She worked for The Guardian. Victoria, what do you think, what are your reflections about the Western media's coverage of what is taking place in Gaza?
Well, I'm an exile from the Western media in Britain, although I still seem to manage in France. But I want to say, as this shows, and in fact the Al Jazeera numbers are at least 10 more than that. And I feel that our whole presence here is actually entirely about them and the courage of their lives. As Lubna would say, every day they go out and they do the same things with all the losses and all the deprivation that they have. I wanted to just make one very obvious point. I've been a reporter in wars in Vietnam, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Cambodia, lots and lots of places in the global south. And sometimes my colleagues have been killed. They were killed when helicopter accidents or recklessness, particularly photographers, and one was killed in an asthma attack. This is a completely different matter. This is targeting on such a grand scale, and we know many examples of countries that are hostile to journalists in which they either get imprisoned or killed quietly, but that's individual. This is a mass thing, and as Lubna said, it's trying to prevent the world from knowing. And when you think of all the reports that we see from the UN, from all kinds of Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, all those reports, and a lot of what we've heard here, depend on the work of those journalists. They are the crucial thing that will bring this to an end. So I just wanted to make that how enormously different this phenomenon is. And linked to it, I just wanted to raise the question of one of the narratives in the Western press is, because Western journalists aren't in Gaza, we can't find out what's going on. And it's so monstrous to hear this again and again. We should really press for Western journalists to be in Gaza. I'm telling you, there's no Western journalist could do this job. They're completely ill-equipped. So this is the kind of ridiculous fake narrative that takes up the space and stops people thinking about everything that Lubna has talked about, which is so real. I mean, I'm sure we've all been brought up on, or many of us, perhaps I'm too old to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, which is the Bible to teach people or remind people that media is part of state control. And I think the most hopeful thing that I want to bring up is how that has changed. The Western media basically doesn't exist for anyone that I know who's under 30. They read completely different things. Of course they read social media, but then there are all these new outfits that have started. And one or two people have asked me here what I read. So I just made a tiny list. And some of them will be familiar to you all, some of them may not be. Well, the old dissident news are two American ones, Consortium News and Counterpunch. They may or may not be familiar to you, but they're great. Then there's Dropsite, Jeremy Scahill, Ryan Grimm. This is journalism that is real. And I love it that we have access to it and that people believe in it as opposed to the Western press. There's Mondovice, Palestine Chronicle, Middle East Eye, which I think all of us in one way or another do work for Middle East Eye. Then I just mentioned also Declassified, which I was the opening chair of Declassified, and I think they're doing a fantastic job, completely built up over 3 years. Orient 21, which is multilingual. It's not just a French outfit. It's also in English, it's in Arabic, it's in Farsi, it's in Spanish. I'm part of that world, also involves Afrique 21. And the multilingualness of that is something that I really love, and it's completely absent in the kind of British and American world. And then, of course, you get the social media, all the Instagram and the blue skies, that even if you're not on social media, which I am not, your friends send you these fantastic things all the time. So the way, the mood of what people know has fundamentally changed over this period. I think is optimistic and something that we can all think more about. I won't go on.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And as you've mentioned, it's enormously different. I mean, before actually this panel, I was reading the report prepared by the Turkish ombudsman on the killed journalists in Palestine. As per their figures, apparently during the entire Vietnam War, something like 67 journalists lost their lives during the entire Vietnam War. And here, we're already talking about 200, almost 50 journalists who have been killed, and that shows us the enormous difference as to what is taking place right now. Right now, I mean, you referred to non-English speaking media, and I heard that, just Kenize needs to leave. That's why, just we will give the floor to her first and foremost. And Kenize Mourad, she is yes, Kenize is with us right now. I hope she hears us. I can see from her face that she might. Kenize is a Turkish-French journalist. She worked for years for mainstream French media outlets and reported on the Middle East, from the Middle East. Her latest book, Our Sacred Lens, I mean, it is out, I mean, being published with certain challenges and difficulties on Palestine. And Kenize, over to you. Yes, we will be discussing, we have been discussing, and we will be discussing a lot about the English-speaking media, English being the lingua franca of our days, needless to say. But you know the French-speaking world very well, inside out. How has been the reporting of the Gazan genocide in France and in the French-speaking world, whether we see the same type of bias in that media outlets as well? Over to you.
I'm glad to be with you. I must tell you it's worse. I think it's worse in France. I give you, it has been, there's nearly nothing coming on the TV. One channel sometimes shows something, and on the French channel, mainstream channel, there's nothing about nothing, or very, very little. And also, not only that, I heard that just 1 week ago, a teacher of a school who wanted to do 1 minute silence for Gaza, she was thrown out, she was suspended. Little while before, sometime before, professors of university have been interrogated by the police during hours because they signed something about Gaza, pro-Gaza. One of them who dared to say that Hamas is a resistance organization and not, as he should have said, a terrorist organization. He said resistance, he has been condemned to 8 months jail. So the situation is absolutely terrible. At the beginning of this Gaza drama, we were in France forbidden to do demonstration. There was a lot of demonstration in England, in America. In France, it was forbidden. After some time, it was allowed, but the police was around all over. And one had to stay on the same place, not walk in the street. The thing was very, very tiny thing was allowed. One must say that in France, it's a peculiar situation. Well, Germany, we know they can't do much because, I mean, they're so, I mean, one talks to them all the time about their guilt, what they did under Hitler, etc., etc. France, there's something a little similar. During the Second World War, many French did not behave very well, and we had the Vichy government. And this government helped the Nazi. And this, the Zionists don't let the French to forget it. And the Zionists have become, especially since about 30 years, very, very, very powerful in France, in a very clever way. They are all over in the press, in the medias, in university, in all sorts of different things, but let's talk about university and medias. And I must say that the other part have not organized at all. They are very organized, very, very organized. And now, if you say, and also there is another thing for France, that we have this colonial past, and this war with Algeria. So many French don't like the Muslims, let us say things like it is. Today, Muslim, it has become terrible. Muslim has become an insult. And a Muslim is always suspected to be a terrorist. Added to all this, the government has been trying to pass laws since a few years, and under Mr. Macron, but even before, under Mr. Sarkozy and Hollande, all are more or less the same, to pass law equating anti-Zionism and anti-Israel as being anti-Semitism, which obviously, as said one of our speaker before, has nothing to say. It's not because I would criticize Macron, for instance, that I am anti-French. So they're trying that. They nearly succeed. Each time there are some, scientists or great people from university who still are honest and keep principles and who oppose that. But I'm afraid they will manage sometime, because you see, when I tell you that a teacher who took for telling Hamas was resistance is condemned to 8 months jail, and a teacher who wanted to do 1 minute silence for Gaza has been suspended. For me, my own example, if I can talk about it, I wrote 20 years ago, when I was first a journalist in Nouvel Observateur, which is a center-left paper, supposedly rather sympathetic to Palestine. In fact, each time I was writing something about Palestine, my articles were censored, because, of course, in France there is no censorship, they say, but there's hidden censorship, which is very, very strong. When there are things in an article they don't like, they say, oh, the article is too long, and they cut the passage they don't like. If it is, the whole article they don't like because it's too much pro-Muslim, pro-Palestinian, pro-Middle East, pro-anti-West or anything. They say, well, the article, we have something more important this week, so it will come next week. And it is never published. So this is what we call, what is really, really very strongly hidden censorship. That was when I was a journalist 40 years ago, after I became a writer. But now it's worse. Now there is no, today, if they have to show something about Palestine or something, the very day or the day after, there's a big film about Holocaust. There's not 1 week without or a film or a song or a document about Holocaust or about how the Jews have been persecuted. And one does not think, well, of course, it has been terrible. Holocaust has been terrible. But why does one Holocaust permit to do, for instance, the Germans, they have it wrong on all parts. They have done an Holocaust, and now they think that they are going to be forgiven this Holocaust by allowing another Holocaust. So anyway, to come back to my experience also as a writer, during the first Intifada, I was so outraged to see how the papers were covering in such a, double standard and all that I knew it would be very dangerous for me to write a book about the problem. But if I was not doing it, I would feel could not look at me in the mirror, maybe. So I wrote a book. And this book is, I'll show you. So this has been added after, but the book is called, in English, it has been translated in 4 languages. 8 languages, sorry. At the time, and it is a book, it's a book telling about ordinary people, interviews and portraits of ordinary Palestinian and Israeli in the beginning of the 90s. And I didn't want to do politics, I was just describing. And it's a very, very strong book. And because, people read it and cry. And the thing is, because I always thought that one must talk not only to the intelligence and the head of the people, one has to talk to the hearts. And it's what I'm doing also in my other books. And this, I've put a new thing on this book, which has been written some years ago, but which is very actual, and it's what led to the 7th of October. And it shows the life of the Palestinian, the misery, the persecution, the killings, the children, the children which were one of the child there was coming back from school, and some Israeli soldiers shot on him, on his legs. And I saw him in hospital, and he said, well, they were shooting on me as a way of amusing themselves. I was doing nothing. Other children, of course, were sending stones. And at that time, Sharon had said, we'll make of the Palestinian people of maimed, infirm, I don't know. And he was telling the soldiers to shoot in the legs of the children who were sending stones. What is very interesting in Israel is that many things they do legally, many awful things they do legally. And for instance, to build a house, the Palestinian families are very becoming very big. They need to build a house. You cannot build a house without the permission of the Israeli government, which of course never give permission to the Palestinians. So the Palestinians try to build anyway, and when the house is finished, the army comes and demolishes it. So anyway, I am not going to go on because I think we have to talk about journalism more than, but this book is full of this example where the Israeli are persecuting often within the thing of the law. Again, I must also say my great admiration for the journalists in Palestine now. In my time, when we were a journalist, we were protected in a way. But now, being a journalist, you are targeted because obviously information is the most important thing. And without them, we can't do anything. I think I should leave the thing to others who have to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kenize. It's been great to hear your views regarding the situation, state of affairs in France in the very first place. I happen to be a French speaker as well, and I visit Paris quite frequently, and a lot of the book titles that I see there over the last 1.5 years, actually, they reminded me of all the things that Cemil Hoca has been telling us during the previous session. I mean, after the Gaza, there is an explosion on the books regarding the clash of civilizations in the French-speaking world. La guerre des civilisations, comment défendre l'Occident, l'islamisation de l'Europe. There has been explosion of these titles, and you can see that how that prism affects the way they see or they do not see what is happening right now. On that point, I will move on to Ezgi Basaran. Ezgi is a Turkish journalist, author, academic who writes and reports on the Middle East. Ezgi, you're not only a journalist, you're an academic as well. You come, just with that conceptual framework. And you have been the editor-in-chief of Radikal, one of Turkey's main dailies that reported on human rights issues, basically. Yes. You have been in the editorial board. Yes. And when do you think, Ezgi, this journalistic malpractice, to say the least, that we are facing right now, descends into complicity, into an international crime? Mm-hmm. Where is that thin red line? How do you see that?
Okay. Shall I just move there?
Yeah, what?
Okay. Oh, God. Thank you, Mehmet, and thank you, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I worked as a journalist for 17 years, reporting mainly from Turkey and the Middle East. And that period shaped my understanding of how narratives are constructed, like you said, sometimes manufactured, not just through editorial decisions, but through the political economies and institutional hierarchies that govern what counts as knowledge. So I have since moved into academia, where my current work examines the Middle Eastern politics and Turkish politics, particularly in moments of interaction, convergence, and divergence. So when I speak of media complicity in the Gaza genocide, I do it with full awareness of both the internal constraints of a newsroom and the broader structural conditions under which media operates. So I think what I would like to talk about is three modalities. First is the unpeopling of news stories that involve or related to Palestinians. The second is the myth of objectivity and the strategic production of that myth. And third is just, I think we need to remember the power of algorithms. So as we've had this at the back and the number keeps increasing, and as also Kenize said, these journalists are not being murdered, they're being targeted. So we have to realize that those are not incidental casualties. They are silenced because they are insistent on documenting the war from within. So this is the most overt and brutal way of how the media complicity in the genocide manifested. Other forms are more insidious. Scholars have described a pattern of unpeopling. You can also, I mean, the lawyers would say when, you know, lawyers like the current British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, you know, refuses to call this a genocide, and that is actually called a terminological hair splitting. This can be done through media stories as well. And the media stories can be unpeopled, not only Gaza itself. For example, Palestinians are routinely described as being killed, as something passive, or struck, or stuck, and rarely the murderer is named. And children in Gaza are usually minors, while Israeli children are always children. So the linguistic asymmetry is, you think, accidental, you're mistaken. This is systemic. In a similar way, if you just read the news stories and or just hear the you know, very mainstream quote unquote prestigious news you know, hours, you would hear the descriptor Hamas run for Gaza, which implicitly renders all infrastructure, schools, hospitals, you know, bakeries where you, I mean, there are none left, but so they make it legitimate military targets. This is so insidious. And so in this way, actually, it is the framing that obscures reality rather than manufacturing or fabricating truth. So framing alone suffices. The second major issue is actually used in other issues around the world that are monumental and pivotal. The weaponization of journalistic principle of objectivity. So first, this is an important principle of our trade, but the concept has to first be hollowed out. Then it is strategically applied to an utterly asymmetrical war. Israeli state narratives are rarely challenged. If you have seen one, just send me the link in mainstream news coverage. In the name of so-called objectivity, lies are often given a platform to quote-unquote counterbalance the voices of Palestinians. So this is a grotesque, you know, asymmetry, a false equivalence, because even when, for example, a basic and verifiable Palestinian claim, such as that 2 hours ago my entire family has been wiped out in a matter of hours, this is, you know, treated with suspicion, interrogated for proof, or framed as allegations, allegedly. Meanwhile, official Israeli statements, no matter how implausible or unsubstantiated, are reported uncritically, often repeated verbatim, and granted the authority of fact. This is not objectivity. Journalism does not fulfill its duty by giving equal weight to truth and misinformation and propaganda. This is not what journalists do. To amplify state misinformation and disinformation under the guise of neutrality is not impartial. It does the inverse. So we all also remember how the uncritical circulation of the false beheaded babies by Hamas, it made global headlines, amplified by heads of states, and then it, evaporated. But when it retracted, its purpose had already been fulfilled. It had reinscribed the Israeli exceptionalism and the Palestinian Hamas monstrosity. So I do not believe this is journalistic failure, Said has been cited a lot. As Said said, I think decades ago, media often functions in perfect synchrony with colonial policy. That synchrony today extends from talking points of heads of states or policymakers and think tankers to editorial priorities to the silencing of Palestinians. One last issue we all need to remember is more infrastructure. It's also about the financing of journalism, which is in shambles right now. For example, even beyond the Orientalist habits and colonial hierarchies of Western newsrooms, we now face a bottleneck controlled by a number of unelected and bizarre tech oligarchs. That platforms, social media platforms, as you know, regulate the flow of information. And this is, like you say, where most people now encounter the news. But they are governed by opaque algorithms, surveillance capitalism, and the whims of a few billionaires who allegedly moderate in, perfect political correctness. So yes, there is systemic racism, complacency, and narrative control in the newsrooms, but even these were magically resolved tomorrow, we would still be confronted with the filters of a few eccentric, profit-driven men, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Sundar Pichai, for example. It used to be, we used to have the media censorship, authoritarian reprisal, editorial ownership problem, advertiser problem. Those dynamics remain, but now every journalist and Palestinian witness must also hurdle past these tech barons who decide without any oversight and conscience whose stories circulate and whose are buried. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ezgi, for this tour d'horizon, for this holistic analysis, really. And you referred to the manipulative headlines, basically. And just when we are talking about Israeli kids, it is children. Just when we are referring to Palestinians, it's always minors. And Palestinians, just are always killed in the passive tense. Who did that? It's always up in the air. And I believe it's a good segue for me to move on to Assal Rad. Assal is joining us from Los Angeles. Yes, now we can see her. Assal, it's an ungodly hour in Los Angeles, I believe, and we are so grateful to you for joining us at that time, just in Los Angeles. Assal, you're an academic. You've been working on the U.S. foreign policy, U.S.-Iran relations, Iranian history, and of course on Palestine as well. But I believe over the last 2 years or so, in the very first place, a lot of people got to know you as the so-called headlines fixer. You started, correcting, just all those manipulative headlines. And that's why I believe, you've accumulated a good deal of experience on those manipulative headlines. And what do you think about the underlying biases of the Western media? Why do you think it happens? How do you read that? Over to you.
Honored to be part of an event that's so important and with so many esteemed colleagues to be discussing this. And I don't want to overlap a lot with comments that have already been made. So hopefully I can just build on those comments and we can have more of a discussion. What I think it's interesting as I've been listening to everybody speak, obviously, I thought Victoria's point was so interesting about how we have these alternative medias and younger generations are not reliant on sort of mainstream legacy medias in the West, which is true. And we're happy to know that. And that's part of the reason why you've seen, I mean, I'm in the United States. I've grown up in the US. We are, when it comes to the issue of Israel-Palestine, I don't think, I mean, there might be debates about other European countries that do this, but we're quite propagandized in terms of the way the entire narrative has been framed for decades. And so while we're focused on Gaza because we've watched a live stream genocide unfold every day on our phones, on our devices, in a way that we haven't seen before, A, because of the level of atrocity, and B, because of the access that we have to that information, because, and I think we've talked about this, but it's always important to emphasize, because of Palestinian journalists on the ground. It is, I don't know what word to use, maybe remarkable to think about the fact that Palestinians have to report their own genocide because their Western colleagues refuse to call it that. That is, I think, one of the issues that we'll be studying for years to come. How the Western world, which champions the idea of a free press, and we can talk about what a free press actually is supposed to do, but that champions this idea of a free press as a foundation of their democratic liberal societies, have completely failed in acknowledging the slaughter of their colleagues because they're Palestinian and because the perpetrator of those crimes is Israel. The fact that they've failed to report what is actually happening, and the fact that they've whitewashed Israel's crimes throughout this genocide, as we've seen. And so the narrative shift that you've seen in the US, where there's actually now polling where Israel has lost quite a bit of favor in the American populace, is because of those very sources. The fact that there is social media, the fact that despite the fact that the mainstream media is not showing you these stories, people are still seeing them. At the same time, I would say that legacy media still has a huge role and influence in the broad narrative, especially because we have aged societies. Like there are many, many people over 30 who are still looking at these broadcasts, whether they're watching it on television or whether they're, reading a newspaper, reading something on their phones. I think there's another part where social media actually plays a factor because a lot of individuals in the public are not following these events the way that we necessarily are. And so the way that they're getting information is passive. As you're scrolling through and you see a post or a headline, and this is why I focus so much on headlines, that passive way of receiving information is how thoughts and ideas are being shaped. And this is essentially how propaganda works. If you repeat something over and over and over again, it starts to stick in people's minds and they assume that it's a truth. For instance, if you've ever heard the phrase, Israel has a right to defend itself, because it gets repeated over and over and over again. But you never hear the phrase, Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. Palestine has a right to defend itself. Iraq has a right to defend itself. Iran has a right to defend itself. Lebanon has a right to defend itself. That phrase is never uttered, but Israel has a right to defend itself is repeatedly said until this becomes an ingrained concept within the mind of the public. And so this brings me to the sort of question, again, not repeating the fact that I think we've covered a little bit about how, how dehumanizing language works, how whitewashing works by lack of attribution to Israel, not naming Israel as the culprit, how framing is important. We've discussed all of that. So let's just talk for a moment about what is a free press? What's supposed to be a free press? What's the difference between what we call a free press in the West and an authoritarian or the press under an authoritarian state? Well, in an authoritarian system, there's no journalistic freedom, theoretically. And that means that journalists or these institutions, media institutions, simply repeat what the state says because there's no space in which they can challenge the state narrative. That's precisely what we've seen occur in terms of how Western media has covered the Gaza genocide. Just the fact that they don't use the word genocide to describe what is happening. The fact that there have been UN reports that concluded that Israel is committing genocide that get basically no coverage in the West. When the largest human rights organizations in the world, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, come out with reports saying Israel is committing genocide, meaning they've concluded that Israel's actions constitute genocide. It's still framed as allegations. And within the same headline, you get something that says, Israel denies this, as if the party committing genocide has an equal say in whether or not they are committing genocide, and not the institutions that were created to prevent said genocide from happening. So what you've seen in the Western media is a repetition of whatever is the Israeli state says, Israeli officials say, as truth. It's presented as truth. Israel says is often, you don't even have to see Israel says. You'll see headlines that say, 50 Palestinians, well, I wish they would say 50 Palestinians killed, but, 50 people killed in Israeli airstrike targeting Hamas. It doesn't even say Israel says they were targeting Hamas. It just says targeting Hamas, stated as a fact, when those 50 people who died, most of which were women and children, clearly not targeting Hamas. So this is the kind of repetition of Israeli positions that you see, as well as US government positions. When it was the Biden administration, whatever the Biden administration said, that was repeated in the news. If President Biden questioned the death toll, which he did very early on in the genocide, dehumanizing Palestinians in the process, that's when you see the emergence of this phrase when he says he doesn't trust those numbers of Hamas-run health ministry. And the media picks this up and everybody starts using it, all to undermine the numbers, which are actually underestimates. The number of people killed, we do not know, but we just know it's much higher than what we've actually been able to see, because the chaos on the ground doesn't really allow for accurate counting and measuring and identifying of bodies. Just imagine how many thousands of people are still buried under rubble and they cannot be retrieved because Israel destroys the heavy machinery needed to retrieve those bodies. So the idea of the free press is supposed to be to challenge the state and to tell the truth. It's not to point out what both sides are saying. It's to say, what is the truth? And that is what has been lacking in this coverage. And there's one more point that I wanted to make, and using a concrete example, because we've talked about this idea that a few of the speakers have mentioned Palestinian journalists and the fact that Western journalists foreign journalists have not been allowed into Gaza. But you have Palestinian journalists on the ground. They're trying to do this work, and they are doing this work. The reason why there's reporting lacking sometimes in the Western world is because they don't listen to Palestinians on the ground. So the horrific story of 15 Palestinian medics slaughtered by Israel, which Israel lied about, after burying them in mass graves, crushing their ambulances and burying those along with the bodies. Palestinians were reporting that this was happening many days, about a week before the story finally started getting played on mainstream media. And that's only because the UN finally revealed a mass grave with aid workers, with 15 aid workers still in their, still wearing their uniforms in mass graves with crushed ambulances. So it wasn't until the UN actually revealed the grave that Western media started to pick it up. And what did they do? They started repeating whatever Israel said. As the story came out that Israel was clearly lying, which has happened repeatedly, they were forced to say, well, this casts doubt. This is the framing. This casts doubt on Israel's story. No, Israel lied, because Israel lies repeatedly, but you'll never see that phrase used. Not only will you never see the phrase Israel lied used, but they will continue to cite Israeli sources as being factually true, despite the many, many lies that they have been caught in. So this is the sort of picture that has been created where whatever Israel says is fact. Palestinians, who are actually the ones being slaughtered and are reporting their own news, have to be verified somehow by some outside source in order for it to have legitimacy. And we can discuss, this is a separate conversation, I think. We can discuss the racial bias, the racism, the anti-Palestinian bias that plays into the anti-Muslim bias, all of these layers that play into how the story is being told. But the reality of it is the story is not being told, at least not by the mainstream Western press.
keep doing it. Thank you very much. And now I will move on to Lauren Booth. I mean, Lauren is a journalist, but not only a journalist, she is an activist as well, and a very active activist in that. She has been involved in, just various aid campaigns towards Gaza. She has spent quite some time in Gaza, and she has been reporting, of course, on the Gazan genocide, prolifically as well. Lauren, I know that you also, have a few words to say regarding the Western media's framing and how this amounts to complicity. Do you want to speak from here or there? It's up to you.
But I won't be too long, promise. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, wa ali Muhammad, kama sallaita Ibrahim wa ali Ibrahim, innaka Hamidun Majid, assalamu alaikum, peace to you. What horrible testimony we've heard so far, but here's one to add to it that's very interesting. Julius Straker at the Nuremberg trials was convicted. He was convicted not of violence, not of partaking in violence, not of carrying a gun. He was convicted because his speeches and his writings were found to have contributed to genocide. He was hanged. When we talk about the complicity of journalism, we are not talking about a small thing now. We are talking about the arguments that have directly led and allowed the governments to make their arguments towards a genocide supporting Israel in what they do. And these arguments made in the press, by the way, allow a cover for the arms trade to continue, because Israel has a right to defend itself. So I do want to go a little bit in the next couple of minutes into frame building so that we all understand what it's about. And as my Turkish colleague here said, there's no accidents in journalism. Everything is sub-edited and checked. Nobody's just stumbling across these phrases. So linguistically, the term frame building refers to how journalists select stories, facts, and what to focus on at each point. And every story has a frame. When I first reported from the West Bank, I went to Jenin and I met children on the rubble of their homes. And I had to dig my nails into my hand almost until they bled to stop from crying and patronizing them with my Western tears. And I managed to do it. But I got a question out at the same time through a translator. What do you want to be, darling, when you grow up? I'm not saying I was a brilliant Middle Eastern journalist at that point. So I asked them, what do you want to be? And a 9-year-old said to me, I want to be a doctor. And the next little girl said, I want to be a teacher. And the next little girl said, I want to be a psychotherapist. These are on the rubble of their Jenin homes with no shoes. So I said, psychotherapist, thinking, how does she even know that word? Why? And her answer went right to my heart. She said, because my people are in pain and I want to help them. I wrote this. Now, I was naive. It was my first article from Palestine. And I said to my editor, Peter Wright at the Mail on Sunday, Peter, don't change a word or I'm pulling this article. You're not really allowed to say that as a journalist, by the way. I don't know who I thought I was, but I said, I'd rather you sack me and I don't do anything. I feel that strongly about what I've seen. He looked at it and he got back and he said, it's a great article. We'll print it. And I said, as is? He said, yes. And I had a moment of feeling that I'd brought world peace. It wasn't that hard to get stuff in about Palestine. What was everybody making a fuss about? I called all my Palestinian friends. I called Afif Safia, who was the delegate to the United Kingdom from Palestine at the time. I said, I've nailed it. Get the Mail on Sunday next week. And there was the picture on the front page of the magazine of me standing in front of these beautiful Palestinian children on the rubble of their homes. And the headline across their faces said, which of these children will be a doctor and which a terrorist? This is part of making the argument for the crimes of today. It didn't start on October the 7th. It's not new, and it is deliberate. Now, the themes and sound bites that we've been seeing throughout this have been handpicked and chosen. Some of them are presented by think tanks. usually run by Zionist money from the United States, but Britain is perfectly capable of having our pro-Zionist think tanks too. And so if I say to you, bring them home, you can go, rescue the hostages. It's like a game. Beheaded babies, women were raped. Human shields, Hamas using the population. End Hamas. Here comes the mission creep of the Israelis. Shifa Command Center. It's under the ground. The tunnel's under the ground. But as my Turkish colleague said, you couldn't say anything from the Palestinian side. Do you have a soundbite that sticks in your mind from a representative from anywhere in Gaza that is memorable, that stays with you? This is not a game. This is very, very serious. And it is time that people are held accountable. And we have to think of the mechanisms that are going to allow that to happen. But first of all, we have to unpick. Who are these editors? Who are they working with? What is the phone call that comes in at 2 a.m, right? I've been in newsrooms like you. You know, the next day, had a phone call from the Israeli embassy. So what? I mean, literally, so what? Are we a British newspaper or not? But the right phone call at the right time, headlines get changed. We can't really have that person on. And I'll end with this, because it was one of the most visceral, kind of obvious moments on British TV. Hossam Zomlot, the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, in November 2023, had a great deal of members of his family wiped out in a Zionist missile, and he went straight into an interview on Newsnight with Kirsty Walk. And he said, look, my family in Khan Yunus have just been decimated, so, this is what the weaponry is doing right now. And she said, oh, it's terrible to hear about that, but do you condone violence? This is a sickness, it is deliberate, and I would like to see us at this tribunal start looking at making the mechanisms that allow this to happen payable, pay a price, make journalists, welcome journalists who are whistleblowers, because there have been open letters from as early as the end of October 2023 trying to push for a fair hearing for the Palestinians. And finally, I'd like to say, just a big tribute to all of our colleagues who are on the ground in Gaza. I cut my teeth. Many of them taught me how to do a news package. And it's not just them that are targeted. I think we have to remember that when they go on a story, they know that at home, they may not go back to their children and family. These are crimes. And I pray to God that they get paid for, and the shaheed in heaven, and those who are doing this are going to hell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren, for these very powerful words. But I believe we shouldn't leave it, or we shouldn't delay it until the hell. I mean, we want to see justice in this world. And justice in the other world that is needed as well, but I believe we want to see justice first and foremost in this world, if we can make that happen. And last but not least, Peter Oborne, and actually, again, I believe the conversation flows very well. You referred to Mail on Sunday. Peter knows the world of conservative English media very well. I mean, Peter was the chief political commentator for Daily Telegraph. Peter, you wrote for Mail, for Spectator. You know all the good old chumps, old chaps over there. I mean, you know all of them very well. And not only that, I mean, Lauren, you referred to the financing, funding, just of certain media outlets. Peter wrote on those issues, on the unknown sources of some of Zionist, just media outlets in the UK, and you carried out an in-depth research, Peter, on British-Israeli lobbying efforts, etc. I mean, you know the background picture quite well. What lies at the background? What makes this framing happen? Who are those who give the phone calls at 2 a.m. in the morning that Lauren has referred to? Tell us, Peter.
Slowly, so that we can fathom.
What you say you could work it out. Is this okay? Yeah. put it in another way, I mean, it's, if you go back to the October the 7th and the aftermath, you had the British government led by Rishi Sunak throwing its weight unequivocally behind Israel, and it became clear immediately from the language of Israeli politicians and the actions of the IDF that this was going to be terrible. You then had, and Keir Starmer, then the leader of the opposition, came out and supported Israel and indeed supported collective punishment, we will recollect. And so you had a cross-party cartel in the heart of British politics behind Netanyahu's project in Gaza. In that circumstances, you would have hoped that the press would have played the role of independent. By the way, that includes painting the atrocities of Hamas, but it would also have been about telling the truth about what was going on by the IDF. And the press didn't do that. It actually became part of this cross-party cartel. And so there was Labour, Conservatives, and the British media, and the BBC, all on the same side. Now, so if you did have an objection to the daily slaughter of Palestinians, you had no mainstream place to go in Britain. You couldn't read the papers, and you couldn't, the politics was not there for you. And so there were protesters, the street marches. That was the only way to do it. And the role of the press over the last 18 months has been to target the protesters, to smear, delegitimize the protesters, turn the protesters into anti-Semites, Islamists, terrorist supporters, invent, fabricate, smear. And that has been the story, the fundamental role of the British media. Not been the attempt to tell the truth, it's been an attempt to reinforce the state political Israeli narrative. Of course, they were joined by one further party, the far right. Tommy Robinson, now out of jail, Reform, Farage, etc., coming out. And that is, and what has happened to the British press? It's very hard to say. The main groups are completely pro-Israel, much more so even than the Israeli papers. If you want to find out, I mean, Lubna, about the Hannibal Doctrine or Dahia, you won't get it in the British papers. You won't hear the word apartheid. You won't hear the word genocide. But whereas you will, funnily enough, even papers like the Times of Israel, even the Jerusalem Post sometimes, let alone Haaretz, will tell you what's going on. You won't get it. Or at any rate, you didn't. Something has happened. I was reflecting, actually, we here in Sarajevo, and I think I'm right in saying about the Bosnian genocide. To begin with, the orthodoxy was pro-Serb from Britain. But journalists came here and they sought out the truth. Ed Viliami, Penny Marshall, and they brought the concentration camps to national attention in Britain. From the British public, the conditions in Israeli prisons. Somebody was making the point, brilliant point, about the Amnesty International, human rights. All these reports just ignored or slandered.
Yeah, assaulted.
And meanwhile, the Daily Telegraph, for which I used to work, I've done a check, I don't think I'm wrong, has never reported the death of a single Palestinian journalist. Nothing about it at all. I mean, when the ICJ made its momentous genocide decision in January last year, the Times didn't report it at all. And the Times was supposed to be a paper of record. But it's actually 3 paragraphs on page 42. The Sunday Times, the day after, didn't report it. It's a systematic fake decision. The Daily Mail, for which I used to work, called the ICJ a show trial. So did the Economist, called it a show trial, the same words. So from
Economist?
What?
The Economist.
Try reading The Economist. When there was calls for ceasefire, The Economist ran an editorial saying, why Israel must fight on. So the British press has been part of the whole machinery. I do find this really ugly. You know, if you write a sort of controversial piece which insults an important politician, but somebody, it's a very brave article, Peter. Not a word. No, have we had anything really about the deaths of these 200 Palestinian journalists, 200 more? Quite often you'll get Israeli stories run about them saying that these people are a Hamas, i.e. articles in British newspapers putting a target on their back. They're part of the attack on the Palestinian journalists. And let us not forget the immortal words of David Lammy. There are no journalists in Gaza. That is depersonalization.
Thank you very much, Peter. I believe all of you would agree with me that journalists do know how to, give a message, how to do that succinctly. In that sense, we've been very lucky, just to have all these, wonderful journalists with us. And I believe, I've got actually 5 minutes to get 1 or 2 questions. No. No, okay, apparently I don't. Yeah, exactly. Just you can ask your questions. If you've got any questions, you can ask your questions to our wonderful panel over tea. We're going to have a, coffee break right now. And Assal, Kenize, I don't know if you're still online. We've got certain technological challenges. I don't know if you're still online, but, huge thanks to both of you as well. And huge thanks just to all the panelists who have been here. Thank you very much. But in the very first place, huge thanks to all those who put their lives for the team.